Well, they say the two things in life are inevitable, that's death and taxes. But if you're a Victorian right now, it seems that tax increases are pretty inevitable. Whilst the rest of the country is, to one degree or another, celebrating a tax reduction in the form of the much modified and reduced Stage 3 tax reductions, Victorians, well, they're having a slightly different experience. And if there was one thing that Victoria needed, it was, of course, more taxes. Here to talk to me about the impact of this COVID-19 debt repayment tax is Professor Sinclair Davidson. Professor, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you for having me again.
Now, people could be forgiven for not jumping for joy in the streets of Melbourne right now, but for those who perhaps aren't landowners, they're not landlords, they don't have investment properties that might be affected by these changes, what are the changes that we've seen introduced by the Victorian government?
Well, I just want to start off by saying around death and taxes,
Hmm.
at least death doesn't get worse every year, unlike taxation. So what is happening is that the Victorian government have overspent. They've overspent on infrastructure. They've overspent on shutting down the economy.
Hmm.
They basically have been in spend mode, to the extent that the lollipop people who sort of stop the traffic coming and going are on at least $120,000 a year, which is an astonishing amount of money.
Yeah.
And of course, this all has to be paid for. And how do we pay for this? Well, we tax people.
Hmm.
Now, one of the terrible things about the Australian Federation is that since the Second World War, we have got taxes horribly wrong. The way our system should work is that the states should levy an income tax, and the Commonwealth government should levy all those other nuisance taxes that we currently have.
Right.
And what I say to people, and it sometimes causes a bit of controversy, what I say to people is the Australian taxpayer lost the Second World War
Oh, right.
because we end up in a situation whereby the Commonwealth raises more money than it needs to spend, and the states, on the other hand, can't and don't. So we end up with all these very highly inefficient nuisance taxes, which of course stifle economic activity at the state level.
Look,
That's what we're seeing here.
I'm going to have to cut you off because I fundamentally disagree with what you said. You said that what we should see is income taxes being levied at a state level. What we should see is flat taxes in the form of completely squashed flat down at zero. However, in the real world, excuse me, I've not yet made a full recovery. Here in the real world, where taxes are unfortunately inevitable, people are saying, they're defending this particular levy and saying that given the situation, given that the debt is there, that it does need to be repaid, and I mean, there's an argument to be made that at least they're trying to address the problem. Maybe we shouldn't have got into the problem in the first place, but there's an argument to be made that
Mm-hmm.
says, well, they're trying to do something about
Mm-hmm.
it. There are many people defending this as a really good option, hitting property owners, especially property investors. They're one of the media's favourite whipping boy groups to be able to lay hate onto. They're those evil landlords that are undoubtedly responsible for the housing shortage and for rental properties being so completely unaffordable. Isn't this, of all of the available options, one of the good ones?
Yes and no. Yes, it is, because Adam Smith 250 years ago said that a land tax is a great idea. Now, just to backtrack a bit, how do we get to this conclusion? Is that there's a thing in economic theory called tax incidence. And this is a story around who bears the burden of the tax. So we have legal incidence, the person who writes the check to the government, and then we have economic incidence, the person who bears the burden
Right.
of the tax. Now, the economic incidence of the tax depends upon the supply and demand for the good and service being taxed. And this
Okay.
is quite a complicated thing, so I want to keep it very simple. Adam Smith made the argument that the supply of land is fixed. So we have what economists would call an inelastic supply curve. And as a result of the supply curve of land being fixed, you could tax land and it would have no adverse economic consequence. The landlord would be poorer because they would be paying the tax, but there would be no other economic consequence of a land tax. So if you believe that story to be true, then yes, a land tax is a great idea.
Well, I can already poke some holes in it, and I'm sure you weren't finished. I'm sure you had some holes to poke, but I'll name one objection immediately. Excuse me, I'm still recovering from that chest infection I got while I was in the US. Um, The issue there is we don't live on land, we live in houses, in dwellings of some sort, and they have to be constructed. And the construction of a lot of the new ones is funded by investors and speculators who are anticipating making money over the long term, whether by capital growth or through rental. So surely we're going to see a downturn in the availability of new housing supply as we punish investors.
If Adam Smith is right, then your argument is wrong.
Well, Adam Smith is wrong then.
Luckily, Adam Smith made one mistake in his Great Wealth of Nations book where he discussed this, and this was the mistake that he made. He made the mistake of arguing that land is fixed in supply. Now, many of the viewers of this show are going to agree with Adam Smith. They're going to say straight away, of course, land is fixed in supply. I mean, you're probably a bit young to remember the original Superman movies, where in the original Superman movies, Lex Luthor, the villain, was trying to create more land. And in the first movie, he was trying to destroy California by blowing up the San Andreas Fault, and he was buying up land in Nevada.
I'm starting to like this guy already, blowing up California.
You are. And in one of the later movies, he was trying to lift the Atlantic Ocean, but he was trying to manipulate land prices because they weren't making more land. Right. But as you said quite correctly, land is not something that we should think about in a geographic sense, where more or less they aren't making anymore. Land is something we should think about in an economic sense. Now, what happens is everybody's got a house, everybody's got a spare room, and if the value of land suddenly becomes a lot more valuable, goes up in price dramatically, all of a sudden the price of the housing stock goes up, and what do? We rent out our spare room. This is the Airbnb model. So in actual fact, the supply of land in terms of housing space and economic space is not fixed. It is variable. And the supply goes up and down as prices go up and down, which more or less means the whole argument that you can tax land with impunity is wrong. Wrong for the very same reasons that you just mentioned. But if I am a policymaker and I have the full weight of economics over the last 250 years, including Adam Smith, and I have on the other side Topher, sorry, Topher, I'm not believing you, because quite honestly, we live in a world where policymakers can't deviate too far from mainstream opinion. And this mainstream opinion has got an incredible, valuable pedigree all the way back to Adam Smith, where he made that one mistake. And unfortunately, it's an important mistake because a lot of people believe you can simply tax land with impunity with no economic cost. There's an entire school of economic thought built around this, based upon the 19th century journalist and economist Henry George. His argument is that you could fund all of society by having a modest land tax as opposed to an income tax, which is just simply wrong.
Well, that's actually amazing you bring that up, because I can recall, it would have to be 10 years ago now, having quite a vigorous debate with someone who was trying to make exactly that argument, saying we could abolish all the other taxes, just have a land tax. And if I recall correctly, he was saying it would be something in the order of 0.25%, about a quarter of a percentage point of the capital improved value of the land. And the arguments he was making, he was simply overplaying his hand. I wasn't opposed, and I'm not opposed to the idea that it might be better than what we've got. I'm open to that argument. But he was making the argument, one, you could abolish every other tax. Number two, that it would magically cause all land to be used in a more efficient manner for a better purpose. And that was so easily debunked. I turned around to him and I said, well, we were on a tram. It was a mate of mine, and this is an ongoing conversation over a long period of time. We were on a tram. I remember where we were. We were on Spencer Street, and there was behind some construction hoarding a block of land that had not had anything done with it for at least 10 years by that point in time. And I pointed to that and I said, if that person owes money on that land and they're paying at least 5% per annum interest already, what's another 0.25% going to do to change their behaviour and to make them finally put that land to use? So it seems that some of the fundamentals, some of the basics of economics are missing in this pro-land tax debate.
Unfortunately, the example of land tax being a tax with a perfect inelastic supply curve is used as an example in almost every single first-year textbook.
Right.
And every first year economics student learns this and believes it to be true and simply goes through life simply parroting what they've learned at university. Now, one of the biggest problems is that you really struggle to get students to remember the things that are true that you tell them, but they never have any problem remembering the things that are not true. And the idea that a land tax is an efficient tax is one of them. Ironically, a land tax is an astonishingly inefficient tax because one of the principles of taxation is that it should be easy to pay the tax.
Right.
So if you are paying tax on income, you've received money and then you give money back to the government. That is easy way to pay tax. Whereas when you have a land tax, what's happened is very often you don't receive an income from the house or the property
Sure.
that you own already. You've got to sell that property. So in actual fact, the land tax is an incredible burden on, say, retirees, and also on young people who are renting, because what is happening is in the case of Victoria, is that people who are renting, their landlord is being hit by this levy, and they are simply passing on, if not all of it, a fair chunk of it onto their tenants who are renting. And so younger people who haven't got a foot into the household market yet are bearing the burden of this particular tax. So retirees and young people are probably being hit quite hard, people who are less able to pay this tax compared to other forms of taxation that we have available to us. So it's particularly dangerous. The other problem there that we have very often when people say we're going to have a more efficient usage of land, these people are social engineers.
Right.
Now, very often, a lot of social engineers claim to be well-meaning, and indeed some of them even are well-meaning. But we always know that when you get things wrong, you end up making huge mistakes. So we should try to avoid social engineering as much as we possibly can, which means, coming back to taxation, your idea of a flat tax is a great idea. In practice, flat at zero, I would love it myself, but let's be practical here.
Hey, a man
you could
can
probably
dream. Don't
get
crush
away
my
with
dreams.
10%.
Don't crush my dreams.
No, but you could get away with, say, 10 or 15%. And then, of course, the biggest problem in Australia isn't that we tax too little, is that our governments spend too much.
Sure.
And we've actually got to start thinking about mechanisms of constraining that spending. And certainly in the case of the state governments of Australia, where there's like total fiscal irresponsibility as far as the eye can see, where Victoria is simply the worst example of this. Nonetheless, we need to start coming up with mechanisms to constrain spending and live within the already exorbitant taxes that we currently have before governments then start borrowing.
Well, Javier Milei, I think, is giving us a masterclass in what we should at least be trying to do. And it starts with a chainsaw, for those that haven't been following his progress over there. Now, before we finish up, I do want to put some numbers onto this. This has been doing the rounds on X. I don't know the original source of it. I apologise, but someone has stitched together their 2022 and 2024 land tax assessment. So this is someone who presumably owns a rental property. And it has gone up by 2.5 times. This is in Victoria. It has gone up by a factor of approximately 2.5 in 2 years. What happened to the 2023 one, I don't know, but this is comparing 22 with 24. Now, you've already made the point that a lot of this is going to get passed on directly to renters. This strikes me as an incredibly regressive tax. Could you let people in? What's a progressive tax versus a regressive tax, and why is something like this particularly dangerous for low-income people?
So the idea of a progressive tax is that the tax burden increases as your income increases. So the amount that you pay. The idea of a regressive tax is the percentage of your income that you pay as tax increases as your income decreases. So, for example, most taxes in Australia are regressive. So, for example, if you have a flat 10% tax rate and you're earning $100, you are paying $10. If you're earning $200, you're paying $20. And the ratio has remained constant. If the ratio changes as your income increases, so progressive income tax, it goes from, I think it's 19% of the lowest rate to 30 to 37 to 45. As your income rises, that's a progressive tax. Most taxes are regressive, which means that they have a bigger burden on lower income earners than they do on higher income earners. And a land tax in this particular sense would certainly be impacting people who are renting, because after all, that's what the land tax is actually on rental properties, and then also on shops and stores in the CBD and what have you. It's a very narrow tax, the land tax in any event. But that will be falling on people who have got lower incomes who are renting as opposed to people who are buying. And I think we can safely assume that renters are going to be on lower incomes than people who are buying. There are some exceptions to that particular rule, but certainly younger people renting, lower income people renting, retirees renting, they are the people bearing the burden of this particular tax, the more vulnerable people in society. And we have a left-wing government that be saying, oh, we're slugging the rich. But in actual fact, if you think of many landlords themselves, people who negatively gear, they are sort of middle-income earners trying to get ahead, trying to put a little bit more away for their retirement than super allows. So think of school principals, some teachers, nurses, policemen, these sorts of people who are not on great incomes, but nonetheless can become a landlord because that's a business for them on the side. So these middle income earners and low income earners are actually getting slugged here by a greedy government, basically, who's telling some propaganda story, lying to our faces, in actual fact, lying to our faces about who is actually bearing the burden of this tax. And they should be ashamed of themselves. And good on you, Topher, for calling him out.
Well, if there's one thing that this says to me, it's that the COVID spending party is over. And the time of the hangover is well and truly here. I can't help but think that the pain is only going to get worse for at least a few years for those who are still in Victoria. Professor Sinclair Davidson, thank you as always for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you.